Hello and welcome to episode 4 of my live video podcast format on catalyzing radical systemic change. And today's topic is radical self-coaching and trauma. And why do I think that topic is of utter importance for our collective destiny as humanity? Because the older I get, I truly feel that we as humanity are all or many, maybe most of us collectively traumatized because in our ancestry lines, we all hold victims and perpetrators. And this is not just true for my German background, this is definitely true for all colonial nations, be it on the sides of those colonizing or those being colonized. And this might be very stark examples of trauma, but many of us have encountered difficult episodes, and both individually and collectively, I feel we have a lot of coping mechanisms that withhold us from truly feeling us as one human family. Um, Yeah, so without further ado, I really feel grateful that today's guests are Bridgee and Marius, um, close friends in Berlin, um, and they do both coaching and therapy. So together with them, together with you, Bridgee and Marius, I want to unpack trauma, look into the box of trauma, better understand trauma, and what can we do both individually and collectively to heal trauma. And I would like to hand over to either one of you, be it Bridgie or Marius, to introduce yourself. I always call it like a quick sketch through your biography. What made you work like you're working now?
Well,
No biggie, right?
no biggie right now. Thank you. We're really happy to be here, and then I will make the start today. Well, my biography is rather classical when it comes to working as a therapist. Like you said before, every one of us has some kind of trauma and adverse experience in their life coming up, growing up, and it's the same with me. So I started by looking for answers for myself and embarked on the journey of studying history because I, as you also mentioned, started with the bigger picture of the whole world and political things that played a role in the Second World War and the First World War and all the things that we grow up here in Germany with. And then I tracked that back to my own upbringing and history and ended up studying psychology and finished my master's degree in clinical psychology. And in that adventure of mine, I met Bridgie and we aligned a lot when it came to how we see people and what our outlook on human beings is and how we think trauma is influencing us and how it should be dealt with in a more compassionate and humanized way and not like the classical system in Germany is dealing with it right now and at the moment. And through these kind of philosophical and very theoretical conversations we had from the get-go, we came rather quickly to the point where we said, well, if the system is not what we would like it to be, then how about we radically change something and start our own way of doing it? And that's the very short and compromised version. Also, one of the cornerstones of it is that we work together with people as the two of us in sessions, but we can go into that in a later
time.
and with more detail why and what's the benefits
Yeah,
from that.
thanks for sharing. Bridgie.
Well, my answer is very similar. So I'm neurodiverse, which means even as a very young child, I had to struggle to understand the world around me, which just really drove me to analyze human nature and to want to understand what drives people and what causes all the suffering I could see from a very early age on. How could the things be addressed? I had to really figure out from all the things that I could see in front of my eyes, right? What was I able and allowed to address, and what was something that people didn't, that the social contract, social contract dictated that you don't ever address, right? So that led me to psychology as well, and trauma and philosophy and lots of other subjects. So and then 5 years ago, we were doing PsyCare at a festival, actually. And well, in case people don't know, there is always a team comprised of one male presenting and one female presenting person. So to work with both energies. And people were asking us, do you do therapy this way? And to us, it was like a light bulb went off and went on. And we looked at each other and we said, yeah, we should. That's actually a really good idea. And it's been really rewarding to do therapy this way and to be able to work with these energies and help people in this way.
Then let's start literally just with the word trauma. So if I imagine trauma is an umbrella or a hashtag or a title, what's the best way for somebody that, let's say, doesn't have a pattern detector perceiving trauma out there? Because it took me in my own biography a very long healing journey to understand my own trauma, my burning trauma when I burned myself as a child. And I was working on, let's say, very different realms. And I have the feeling to unpack trauma. It's important for the audience to understand that trauma is not just people in war or people that get multiple times raped. So like these very stark examples. So yeah, handing over to you, what's the best way to unpack the word?
There are two ways to answer that. The first one is trauma in itself, like you said, is sometimes really hard to grasp. And the reason for that is there is no very precise definition of it, in the sense of, if you go through XYZ, then that leads to trauma, because that's very individual. There is some kind of incident, and what makes it traumatic is if the person's worldview or the structure this person created over how many years, whatever, is shaken to their ground, so they don't feel like they can understand their surroundings anymore. Everything they believe to know doesn't make sense because of this incident. That is traumatic. And the second part of it is the integration. If they have a good surrounding system, like a family, loved ones who can help them integrate this experience and make sense of it again, then that will also lead to a very challenging but not necessarily traumatic outcome of it in the long term. And that's true for every kind of happenings. So if it's a plane crash or the developmental issues, that can be true for all of it. So that's mainly what makes it traumatic, if there's not enough integration and someone feels overwhelmed and alone with it.
Yeah, I would add, well, so actually trauma has a really bad reputation, has this really negative connotation, but developmentally speaking, it's just a natural process of individuation and just being human, right? So birth itself is traumatic. We come from this perfect environment where all our needs are taken care of. There's no pain, there's no hunger. We feel our mother's heartbeat. We're in this cocoon, right? We're safe. This is just really paradise. That's where we come from. This unity. And then the first traumatic experience often is birth, right? You're all of a sudden in this strange environment. You're exposed to air, light, hunger, lots of sensory stimuli. So what trauma really is trauma will accompany each one of us all our lives, and it's only when we don't have the help necessary to integrate it that it becomes damaging to the psyche, damaging to all of us. So in fact, birth can be traumatic. Not having somebody to hold you to help the child integrate those sensory, like the sensory input, right? That leads to lasting imprint. Then
not being helped to make sense of the experience.
exactly.
Like, what's light? What's hunger? It wasn't there before. So what is it? How can I soothe it? And no child can do this by themselves, and they need a mother to,
or primary caretaker,
whoever it is, to make this an effort, the two of them or three of them together, and not leave the baby hanging in dry air in that case.
Yeah, so and then there are lots of different versions of trauma. So there's developmental trauma that happens over an extended period of time. Then there is shock trauma, like the burn you mentioned, right? That's one incident that leads to this traumatic response. Then there is transgenerational trauma, there is collective trauma. So there's different quality, it has different qualities to it. And all of these traumas need to be dealt with in different ways.
But in common is that it's about the integration that was missing and the necessary surroundings to make sense of it.
Yeah.
These two things are in common with all of them, but have to be addressed differently, of course.
So for the sake of for the lack of a better word, so if I were to put trauma into different verticals or buckets, trying to categorize it, there seems to be developmental trauma, there seems to be shock trauma. What other categories of trauma are there?
Or transgenerational, I think, is
transgenerational and the collective trauma. These were like kind of the four ones. So I'm coming back to that example of birth, because truly I've never been thinking it that way around. So you would say that making traumatic experiences is actually a developmental necessity. It's basically inevitable, like kind of almost like you want to learn to ride the bicycle. It's like very likely you fall down and whatever, have a bleeding nose or whatever, get a scratch. But hopefully this falling from the bike should not lead to developmentally, or if it's like a heavy falling from the bike accident, lead to, let's say, coping mechanisms later on in life. Besides the caring and nurturing background, what other factors help people get along and integrate traumatic experiences?
Well, first of all, I think I would like to link it back to your initial question, right? Your initial question was, how do you learn to see trauma, right, outside of yourself? And the answer was, you first need to see it in yourself, because how can you recognize something outside yourself if you're unable to recognize it within yourself, right? And then and that's the answer to the second question as well. So how do you deal with it? By learning to look at yourself with compassion, right? And to integrate this, to reparent yourself, and to be the help you never received, basically to understand what it is that shaped you, what those patterns are, and then slowly work towards integrating.
Yeah. Now I see an almost paradoxical, weirdly intertwined societal amalgamate out there, which is, I have the feeling those most traumatized and least aware are shaping the way our society works and functions. So a lot of the people that I see in positions of power, so obviously I would say like some politicians pretty obviously, or some other very powerful bankers or whatever, they seem like heavily traumatized, right? But they are not aware of it. most likely, even if we tell them, well, you're traumatized, go do some therapy, do some integration, they would never perceive it. So what I would like to link our dialogue today, and I don't have answers to all of that, is to link the individual healing piece to the collective and societal piece, because one of the reasons why I'm embarking on this, let's say, journey with you today is that one of my big hopes for us as humanity, as a collective, is that when more and more individual people work through their individual traumas, then the likelihood of a new culture and a new we space within a nation, but also like globally, I feel like can emerge. But I also have the feeling there's still a long way to go. So I'm not too sure, let's say, how political it is just because I do my individual therapy. And again, I don't have an answer to that.
Well, I will say the answer to that in the shortest version of it, yes, that's exactly how it has to be. That's the only way.
And everything's political, right?
And everything is political in one or another degree. But let's dive a little bit in there. What we can see from people coming to us, if it's an individual person or a couple or more some, what makes them come are mostly they reach a point in their life where the coping mechanisms they unconsciously developed in their childhood or whenever their adverse experience took place, when they are not working anymore. There is a price. There's always a price for those kind of coping mechanisms, and at some point in their lives, mostly at the end of adolescence, so in the mid 20s, early 30s, they recognize that the way they try to solve this is not working anymore, and then there is the price gets higher and higher, and the inner pressure gets too high at some point, and then they seek help because they feel that they can solve this within themselves by themselves. And this is the point where they mostly show up. And to put it in a bigger perspective, what we recognized in the last 1.5 years is that a pandemic like COVID made a lot of these coping mechanisms that are also from our society very much pushed, like working 80 hours a week or consumption and all of these kind of things that you can use to numb yourself and not look at yourself. And they had no really a price. They were even promoted by our society, and you were patted on the shoulder, well, you're so good at your job and all of these kind of things. And they broke down a little bit in the last 1.5 years. And so many people had so much more time at their hand, and they had to start thinking. And yeah, that's what we saw as one of the main things in the last 1.5 years.
Before we dive into the healing piece, I want to pick on what you were saying on coping mechanisms and numbing. Could you elaborate, like let's say, the broad variety of coping mechanisms, and are there like healthier or unhealthier coping mechanisms, and are there patterns in between, let's say, certain kind of traumas and certain coping mechanisms?
Wow, that's a very dense topic. I mean, I could talk about this forever. But I think, okay, so let's give one example. Something that we see very often is a profound lack of self-worth, right? We live in a capitalist society here in Germany, and capitalism teaches a certain work ethic, a certain, let's call it Puritan work ethic, right? Where you're worth what you produce, basically. And we see very often how harmful it is to have internalize capitalism to a degree where you really truly believe as a human being that your worth depends on what you do, not who you are, right? And then people cope with this by they fill this void that this injury that their ego suffered very early on, right? They fill it with brands like, I don't know, watches, cars, whatever, right? Influencing on Instagram, whatever gets them instant feedback, recognition in society, whatever makes them feel like they're increasing their worth, right? And a lot of these people have stood still because of a lot of these coping mechanisms have just broken down. Somebody was forced to work from home. They had to work a lot less hours, right? They had to exit the hamster wheel. And then what happens? They were alone with themselves in their apartment for a very long period of time. So they started thinking they couldn't escape anymore. And then they show up for themselves for the first time, truly. And then we can start having exactly this conversation, you know? What are you worth? Who are you?
And regarding your question about the coping mechanisms, what we see most of the times in people is that whatever shaped them, if it's parents or societal norms, at some point, and there it comes back to the Freudian Über-Ich, you take these kind of influences from the outside and make them your own. You create an inner representation of them to be able to navigate within yourself what you think will happen on the outside and adjust it already. And in that sense, you work against your inner child. The voices that told you can't do X or Y or Z, you integrate them into yourself and you talk to yourself like that. And there are many varieties of that, but this is a general grounding of a bad coping mechanism because it leads to you neglecting your own needs within yourself.
And then to bring this to connect this to the wider perspective, right? Which is the collective. How does this influence the collective? Well, if there's so many people who carry this deep wound, right? Then society, in a way, suffers the consequences because then they can be exploited, right? So a happy person will not be a follower. A happy person who feels worthy is not going to blindly follow a regime, will think for themselves, right? So the more injured somebody is, the more dependent they are on outside influences, outside validation. So a lot of political systems aren't really interested in people being whole.
And I like that political touch. So
I hope I'm not going to get in trouble for that.
yeah,
Maybe censored.
Probably censored.
we cut it out, you know, right after the live stream, we cut it out. But I truly want to pick on that, and I'm not definitely not in our quote unquote more or less democratic society in Germany. I would also not point with the finger to a certain institution saying that they want to keep us traumatized.
No.
But if we look, let's say, more at the capitalist system, I want to pick more on this like consumerist culture, because I truly have the feeling, you were mentioning the political part, I truly have the feeling if more and more people arrive at a sense of self-worth and happiness, instead of needing coping mechanism like binge watching series or constantly buying new clothes or following whatever influencer on whatever social media platform, ultimately also this does not serve the economic system out there. So when I listen in to what you were elaborating so far, I have the feeling both from a political, let's say, following the norm perspective, as well as from a society built on consumerism, healing is not really put on the billboards. Maybe there's really a grain of truth in that, right?
Well, unless it's healing that we consume, right? And there is an industry for healing, a large one as well. So
Yeah, let's pick on the let's pick. No, I like it. That's a good segue to it, because what I find very interesting is these. It feels like there are two big segments in the market. I personally call them the way into the light and the way into the mud, or something like that. So there are people going from therapy to therapy to therapy to therapy to therapy, but never actually becoming aware of actually the light that always shines on that original nature of, let's say, the enlightened beings we actually are. And the other ones that I would coin the spiritual bypassers, they go from one meditative retreat to another meditative retreat, or using and abusing psychedelics to create peak experiences, but never actually complementing that. So maybe, this is not a direct answer, but what does a healthy intersection of these two ways to approach maybe personal development and a happy life in general look to the two of you?
Oh, just a happy life, no big deal. Nothing more, nothing less.
No biggie.
I don't know about happiness, we don't really deal in happiness. We deal more in authenticity. We see ourselves more of facilitators of more authenticity and individual truth rather than happiness.
And to reduce self-inflicted suffering, in the sense of, if there are coping mechanisms which have a really high price in terms of suffering, then we try to replace them with others, with coping mechanisms that have a lesser price in any way. And how we do that is through finding what is their authentic self, what makes them tick, what was locked away in a very early age. And people often come here and ask and want the answer to the question, what do I want? And what we often find out is that everyone knows what they want, but on some deep level, they don't feel like they deserve it, or they don't feel like it's in their reach to get it. And what we try to do is to take these roadblocks, if it's beliefs or whatever it kind of stuff
limiting
it is,
beliefs.
limiting beliefs, to take these roadblocks, examine them, self-actualize them, but because mostly they stem from a time when they were children, and children operate in black and white thinking. Their world is either one or the other. And we try to update it into a version where there are more gray areas, and you can just, have a more variety of decisions to make.
So you mentioned spiritual bypassing, or bypassing in general, going from therapy to therapy and from retreat to retreat. And what happens to these people is they don't stand still. They don't integrate, right? That's what happens. They go from one experience. It doesn't really give them what they're hoping for. They don't take time to sit with it, to integrate it, to see what happens, right? To observe the small changes. They don't integrate it into a new system. They just build it into the old system.
Yeah, a very vivid example of that is many people come here and they're super, they have great businesses, they're really successful, and then they try to use the same approach to therapy. So they come here with an agenda.
Yeah.
I have this 5-week plan, and this is my problem. Okay, now I understood my problem.
What's my goal?
What's my goal? What's the next step?
What's the target?
What's my homework? What can I do to make this concrete?
Yeah.
And then what we say is, no, that's the same system again. That's what brought you here. And then we try to make them shift the perspective from, no, we won't look on what's still to come. We look at what you already did. And then we make them look, you maybe did the same behavior. but you recognize it while doing it. And this awareness, first comes the awareness that you want to change something. You can feel it's not working anymore. Then you could observe it and you can tell us about it. And these 3 steps, they are so crucial, and that's where we pause. Now it's time to celebrate these 3 steps and to honor them before we think about anything else in the future.
Mhm.
And that's the hardest thing to do. So we are, most of the times, we actually breaks. We try to make them stop and pause for a moment.
Yeah, so to me it's super interesting. I think the pause, right? Being in the moment, being present with yourself in the here and now, that's the biggest game changer. So I wonder how the pandemic, that's been such a pause and such a game changer and has forced so many people to stand still in so many ways,
Yeah.
what kind of change will that implement, and will that implement, right?
Um, I had like this aha moment when I was listening into, for us, it's not so much about happiness, it's about authenticity.
Mhm.
And I would like to elaborate more on that because I have the feeling both in the market for spiritual bypassing, like selling peak experiences, and when you just meditate, your whole life will be happy, and then everybody on Instagram, especially the influencers, right? They're
Oh,
like
yeah.
constantly like, I would
Chase.
say, grinning, right?
Mhm.
But also on the other side, let's say on the therapeutical side, I also have the feeling as if people had almost this ideal that a constantly happy life could be possible instead of learning to like circulate like all range
Mhm.
of emotions. So yeah, I really just wanna dive deeper on authenticity and how that relates to happiness.
Mhm. That's such a good point that you just made.
Yeah.
People get so hung up on holding on, like attachment, right? Clinging on to all kinds of things, like monogamous relationship, like clinging to people, clinging to ownership, clinging to our bodies not changing, clinging to not aging, right? There's so much attachment. And so when we're talking about authenticity versus happiness, right? It's just about accepting that being in a permanent state of bliss doesn't exist, will never exist, right? The weather is forever changing, and so are we. So, but being present with yourself in whatever state, that's what's really going to make life beautiful and bearable and authentic and fulfilling, I think. Allowing yourself the full range of emotions, as you said, and not glorifying one and demonizing another.
So it's about creating a toolkit so you can feel contempt no matter what emotion will come up.
Maybe not content,
No.
because we're human after
Well
all.
equipped, well equipped.
But accepting,
Yeah.
sometimes you gotta sit with your misery and let it be, and know that it'll pass.
Yeah,
Nothing is
the
forever.
knowledge that nothing is forever, not the blissful times and not the rainy, nostalgic days.
That's such a Buddhist way of looking at things. I feel like I'm pushing politics
And
and
religion.
all and everything.
And one other thing that just plopped up in my head when we were talking about, we started out with what's trauma, and one thing that is also very common in trauma, no matter which one, is that people have a hard time to stay in the here and now. They're either in the past or they're in the future. They're never in the here and now, and that's one of the things that is accompanied when it comes to healing, to make people realize again there is a future, therefore you can be present in the here and now, or you don't have to be in the past because the here and now is safe enough to stay in it right now, or we can create a safe enough here and now to stay in it.
let's let's riff off the eternal here and now, because again, especially in the spiritual mainstream mindfulness culture, it's all about the power of now.
It is.
It is.
Yes and no, because I truly have the feeling, if you only teach the power of now, but don't become aware of the deeper underlying patterns that actually govern not only your behavior, but also the perception with which you perceive the outside environment, your
Absolutely.
relationship to work, sexuality, your parents, bonding mechanisms, and stuff like that, you can't really be in the here and now. So, yeah, the point I want to make is, I think we now have like maybe 50 years of convergence in between, let's say Eastern spirituality and Western approaches to psychotherapy. And I truly think the truth is in the intersection of these approaches. So when sometimes people approach me and they have been sitting for 10, 20 or more years on a meditation cushion, then I tell them personally, and I'm not a trained psychotherapist, as the two of you know, nor am I a trained meditation teacher, but I did a lot of meditation, I did a lot of trauma work myself. Then usually I advise people that did a lot of meditation to do some therapeutical work or some embodiment work. But when, on the other hand, people are constantly stuck in the mud of their own biography, then maybe incentivizing them to go on a Vipassana retreat or witness the beauty of a psychedelic peak experience can actually free them of this like constantly working through, like, let's say, childhood trauma. So
Yeah.
maybe again, how do you see these two approaches complementing each other?
Well, I think something that's really dangerous is looking at anything as black and white or absolute, right? So you mentioned the power of the here and now, and obviously you can bastardize that too, right? And people can abuse that, and spiritually bypass that too, and focus on the here and now way too much and for all the wrong reasons. But yeah, I totally agree. So absolutely, any sort of, the more angles you're looking at something from, the better, right? You gain more perspective, and do the somatic therapy, do the therapy, go to the retreat, but then at the end of the day, come back to yourself, right? And think about how you're going to integrate those experiences and what are you doing with them, right? It's not about just chasing the now. It's definitely about putting things into perspective.
Yeah, it's about balance.
Yeah, it's about
It's always
balance.
about balance. There are individual balances and they change from day to day, but it's about finding an equilibrium of things to have it all, to think about the past, stay in the here now, and also have an outlook on the future, but from a healthy point, from not from a I need one, from everything can be, and it's good in the sense that you have all of it enough. It's always about having enough and not
Yeah.
focusing too much on one thing.
One question that came up: is there can there be too much trauma in one person or a collective to be healed? Because when we were preparing for the session, or are there various intensities of trauma, and linked to that, how does a healing journey look like? Are there like stations within a healing journey, or is it like completely individually, completely dependent on like each and every single individual?
All very good questions. Well, I think it's really, so one of the most profound understandings that we can offer to everyone we work with is that you don't compare yourself to anyone. You don't compare trauma, right? So there can be a person in the Western world experiencing something as mundane as a car accident and be profoundly affected by it. And then there can be somebody witnessing genocide, right? And having different ways of coping and functioning maybe on a day-to-day basis in a better way. Who knows? But the point is, trauma is really something so personal, and what happened to you doesn't really matter. It matters how it affects you, how much suffering you're experiencing, and healing starts there. When it comes to healing or this goal of healing trauma, right? People think of healing as going to therapy, and then at the end of therapy, the trauma, whatever it was, is gone. But that's sadly not how things work, right? Because we're not surgeons. We can surgically remove the trauma. We can surgically remove what happens to people. We can only teach them tools, and we can facilitate their own efforts of dealing with in better ways, right? And developing coping mechanisms that serve them better in the here and now. It's never about being healed, really.
So-
It's more about learning how to live with it and function.
Yeah. So what we can say is,
Not
and
feel it's
I will
burden.
try to link the question about is there some kind of difference between severity of trauma and kind of a formula that we observe. And what the one thing is, when it comes to when it happened, the earlier it happens, the more severe it is, in the sense that there is less and less individuality and ego developed before,
And language as well,
and
right?
language and thereby tools to cope with it. So if it's pre-verbal, then it's much more fundamental, just by definition.
And also harder to catch,
And
right? Harder
also
to
harder to
address.
catch, because then there are just very different layers and tools involved. That's just a fact. So in that case, this is really more severe. But there are ways to do this, but there is definitely more work necessary. And or different work. And when it comes to what Bridgee just said, what we can see in people is that now I lost my train of thought.
What did I just say?
I don't know. Wait. Exactly. Most people, they start out with coping mechanisms. They're designed to survive, because when it's in early childhood or in childhood, then the only thing that's important is survival. And the price is, it doesn't really matter at that point, because survival is the only thing that is important. And what we want to do in therapy or in coaching with people is go away from the state of I'm still fighting just for my survival to thriving, and to just exchange the outlook on things. And that is what we can offer, and that's what we do.
Right, people come from scarcity, right? And we're helping them to find their way out of the scarcity and see all the tools and all the resources available to them now.
Which weren't available when they initially developed these kind of coping mechanisms. And that's a paradigm shift.
The question was also, is there trauma that cannot be resolved? And I'm sure there is. I mean, some transgenerational traumata are just being passed down through the generations, right? Generation to generation to generation. And there is so much suffering, and some are very hard to resolve. Then there are personality disorders, right? That, like, science is debating. Some people claim some things aren't really solvable, healable in therapy, and
well, that's a box of Pandora, right?
Yeah,
because
it is.
what's being healed is being healed
Exactly.
from which perspective? From the societal perspective of being a
Exactly.
functional consuming person in our Western world. Well, maybe not, but maybe that's not the goal for most people anyways when it comes to healing. Maybe that's what they want to leave behind, and then that's a different answer, right?
Exactly.
But the point is, in that case, you can help people get better, cope better, and feel better within themselves, with themselves. And I think that's the only measurement that is relevant in the end. It's not important if your neighbor thinks you're healed. It's important if you think you're better off than before.
Yeah,
And
if you're experiencing less suffering. So So when people come to us and they say, so what's the goal? What's my target? What's the timeline, right? Then we always say, well, there's only one thing, one measure, one unit of measurement, and it is, are you experiencing less suffering than before?
Yeah. As we're friends and we know each other for a couple of years, and I don't want to touch too much on my healing journey because I did that in the zero edition of the podcast, just for the sake of the listeners just listening to this episode. One of my first childhood experiences was severely burning my left upper leg and suffering from shock trauma, which was translating into like post-traumatic stress disorder and all sorts of coping mechanisms. The question that I want to ask the two of you, I have the feeling, yes, there's like, let's say, incremental changes on the journey to a more authentic, fulfilled, and thriving life. But I also have the feeling there are true breakthroughs, which then you will know this not only from myself, but also from a variety of clients and from literature, where truly the sense of self, where truly that sense of relaxing into life and trusting life is so profound. And I certainly know from my own decade-long healing journey that just the way how functional, how powerful, how much resources I have, how stable I am is so different from like the 3.5 decades before. So I wanted to ask you, when do you see incremental change and when do you see truly breakthroughs? And again, are there underlying patterns on the journey for clients that you see?
Yeah, that's impossible to answer, generally, because it's such an individual thing. And people ask us that all the time, when will I see radical change? And we always refer them back to the incremental change because it starts with that, right? So we always use this example of people walking up the mountain, like they are at the foot of a mountain, they're looking at the peak and they're focused on the peak and they're like, oh my gosh, why am I not doing anything? I'm not getting there. When will I get there, right? Instead, change the perspective and look at the feet, look at your feet and take one step and celebrate that step, right? And that's gonna, before you know it, you'll be at the peak and looking down, right? But just because you focused on taking one step at a time, honor every little small incremental change and don't think about those radical shifts. They will come, they will arrive before you know it, but only if you don't fixate and focus on those and chase them.
That's what we tell our clients. But what we can see from the outside is that it's about finding out that there is another way of living, in the sense that most of these people who have trauma, when it comes to developmental steps, then it's about trusting themselves, trusting their own perception and trusting themselves. And what we can offer is a relationship between us and them that is built on trust, on seeing them, and on reflecting to them that what they experience is true and right. And by mimicking it in the safe space of our office, they start to go out there and creating these kind of situations more and more for themselves on the outside. And collecting these experiences, and then at some point there's a tipping point. They have these bad experience from their childhood and whatever, and then they collect these new things, and at some point they are even, and then it flips. The scale tips to the other side, and then there is this paradigm shift where you can really feel it, and then they trust themselves exponentially more than before this happened. But it builds up, and how it builds up, it's individual, the speed, and that can be put in one formula. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say trust is a really important point, because if you're looking, like when you fixate on the peak, right? you might not actually believe you're walking. You might be looking down at your feet and not believe that you've taken a step, not be able to see the step you've taken, right? So trusting yourself is just such a huge and really a difficult thing to achieve.
And it's a skill to relearn for most.
Yeah.
I had such a deep aha moment just listening to trust, and maybe trust is at the very core of the journey. I'm asking myself, what other faculties need to be developed? I mean, trust, strength, stability, and then also this faculty to work through these intense emotions. Because when I look at my early adolescence, I definitely recognize a trait where I would say at least for a decade, more for 1.5 decades, I mainly used meditative practices, so meditation in my sense, to flee difficult emotions and basically sitting them away on a meditation cushion. And I think it was only in my late 20s to early 30s, being 42 now, where not myself, more my environment made me painfully aware that despite me thinking and perceiving myself of pretty enlightened, for the lack of a better word, and clever and smart, they were actually telling me, well, if we look at your life, close friends, parents, ex-partners, they were telling me it doesn't look like very happy and functional, right? So I'm actually very grateful for those being critical to push me to complement, let's say, my meditative state training, constantly chasing peak experiences, to complement that with the more muddy, painful understanding my own upbringing and biography and my family system and all of that. When I try to loop that back as a question,
You said
are
something.
there what? No, are there segments of clients that you perceive like that they're like typically like bypassers, and how do you deal with them? And then the other side, maybe the people more on the self-pity side, that are constantly complaining. Like, how do we approach these like two archetypals?
Yeah, well, there are many archetypes and there are many ways people deal with their emotions. And you were asking earlier, trust, stability, what kind of tools are necessary, right? And one, I think the most important one is compassion and self-compassion. So how do we look at everyone with compassion, not with judgment? Because judgment is one of the single most painful things that people suffer from: judgment, internalized judgment, judgment of others. So we teach compassion. So whatever somebody brings to the table, we look at it lovingly and we teach them to look at themselves lovingly and to be understanding of their process.
So now that we're approaching almost the first hour, we can make like 2 disclaimers. Now we're putting on the funky hashtags, and I would like to dive a little bit both into the psychedelic realm and into the kink realm, because I've done some research, and there are not so many people who are putting these hashtags out there. So why are you consciously mentioning them on your website?
Well, it's what we specialize in first and foremost. So the fun story is, well, back, I think about 15 years ago, my husband and I were polyamorous, right? And we're pansexual. So a long time ago, we were living in Munich at the time. We wanted to open up our relationship, and we were looking for a kink friendly and
Non-monogamy.
yeah, exactly, open to non-monogamy, right? A therapist who could advise us.
Basically a facilitator to do this opening up process in a conscious and holistic way.
And we couldn't find anyone. So I decided to become that person. I was still in university back then. I was like, if there's no one like this, then I'm going to be this person for others. So, and pay it forward, everything we've received in the years following. So I think it's important to speak about those topics and not pathologize them, because they're often pathologized. So
it's beautiful. I think we have enough a way to speak there for quite a bit. So let's unpack some of the words for the audience, because they're not necessarily all entangled. When you were mentioning the word polyamorous and kink, I mean, obviously it's also not the same. But it seems that classical, sequential, monogamous relationships are not the only ones that exist on the planet. And you found out as a student that when you were trying to open up in a healthy sense your relationship with your husband, that you're, by the way, still with, right?
Absolutely.
Together with Marius, in a loving relationship, and 3 children, that there was nobody out there. So do I imagine your clients coming more from a, well, let's say, non-monogamous background? And are they precisely approaching you for advice on how to steer their unconventional relationships?
Well, we call them non-traditional relationship models, and no, not all of them. Some do. People come to us with all kinds of topics, and no therapist will be able to have lived all of it, right? And draw from personal experience. But at the same time, the more you're on the fringe of society, right, the more you deviate from the norm, the more important it is to see representation and to have somebody who does intimately understand your experience. So it's very important, for instance, for queer people to have queer therapists, right? For people of color to have therapists of color, and to see themselves represented, to know that somebody can relate to something that's so fundamental. And I think the same is true for ethical non-monogamy and for kink as well.
Okay, please elaborate for our audience. What is kink?
Well, what is kink?
What is kink? Well, it's a huge topic, right? But to make it kind of precise when it comes to therapy and why we see healing potential in it. So one kind of trauma is sexual violence, sexual abuse. And in these realms, kink is a container. When it comes to kink, it's called BDSM, and there are practices like power exchanges and dynamics where also people want to receive some kind of pain through getting hit with a stick or whatever. And in this container of 2 adults come there, talk about what their needs are, what they want, and they make a certain amount of rules to make this whole environment safe. This can be really empowering for someone who experienced this without any control and without any agency to come into this room and claiming back the power of their own sexuality, their own pain, and their own joy.
Yeah. I mean, you've spoken about the healing power of kink, right? But I think it's really important to establish that kink doesn't mean, I mean, first of all, what is kink, right? So kink is just everything that's outside of socially acceptable sexuality, everything that society deems normal. Everything outside of that is kink.
And but to say that, for example, what is acceptable in Berlin is not acceptable in Salzgitter or whatever. So
wherever. So obviously it fluctuates. It's socially conditioned. It depends on the age we live in, right? So queerness was once a pathological condition, was regarded as a pathological condition, right? So things change, norms change, and the same is true for sexual norms. They change. So what used to be kink is just it's forever changing. So, and it can be a container for healing, but we're not going to argue that everyone engaging in kink is traumatized.
No.
In fact, there are lots of studies that have shown that practitioners of kinky sexuality are actually much more stable and healthy mentally than the control group, because they have found a way to deal and to get their needs met and to live their desires, right? They're not suppressing their desires, which is making a huge difference.
They're putting it back, linking it back to being authentic. They
Exactly.
are more authentic in the sense of having looked at all of their desires and tried to make them happen.
Yeah, sexuality is such an important thing, so much at the core of who we are, right? So if you're negating this, then you're negating a big part of yourself.
When I was listening in to the kink part, I had the feeling maybe there is no such thing as like kink. It's more a continuum of how contained the box of the norm is that society deems respectable. So the way that I perceive kink, when we just compare, let's say, the last 50 years in Western societies, right, that a lot of what is totally normal during daytime television and Netflix, right, would have been like completely unheard of just like 50 years ago. And then there's like, yeah, it seems like almost like a bell curve of the behavior that's allowed in certain parts of our society, and certainly also in other parts of this globe and cultural backgrounds. Nevertheless, having myself had like this shock trauma, to some of, like, let's say, the very, to myself looking very deviant, sexual behavior, I was always looking at it and saying, are these people just acting out
their trauma,
a very heavy traumatizing experience in early childhood or adolescence? And when I was experimenting myself in the last, let's say, 15 years or so, in the kink environment, I had a very natural reaction, again, like a bell curve, to like things that I found like interesting, some of which I found stimulating, and some of which I still find like pretty scary when I look at them. So since you're deep into the scene, is there not a deeper connection between where people perceive trauma and then they try to integrate it in a healthy way as adults, consenting on what they want to play with?
I would like to, I think, answer this differently or put this differently. We're all reenacting trauma all the time. The more unconscious it is, the more unconsciously we do it. But in many ways, in our relationships, in our friendships, in our jobs, and everything, we reenact trauma.
Every human interaction.
That's how you resolve it, right? That's what repetition compulsions are. That's why people engage in the same type of relationship over and over and over again, right? Not because they're dysfunctional, but because a part of them is very functional and is repeating a certain trauma in order to resolve it. So, and kink is no different, right? People engage in it. Of course, they will. It's human nature. We will use whatever tools available to solve our trauma, to heal it, to resolve the conflict, the initial conflict. So whether you pack this into your social life or you pack this into your sexuality, doesn't really matter. The difference is only that very often these type of reenactments are non-consensual, right? So if you're engaging in some toxic relationship, you're not going to say to your partner, okay, so here I go, I have this trauma, I'm going to reenact it with you. How do you feel about it? Yes or no, right? You're just going to do your shit. And mostly not even realize what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the difference about kink is that very often people have reflected on it and they know exactly what their desires are and why they have them and how they want to enact them. And
that's the healing part.
And there is negotiation, right? You have the safe framework that you build, that you co-create, right? There's this element of co-creation and open communication and consent, and that makes all the difference because none of us consent to our trauma. So having this element of choice, true choice, right? That's the healing part.
And maybe towards the end of our conversation, I at least briefly want to touch upon, like, much like kink, a pretty red flagged topic in our society, which is psychedelics, and link it to trauma and healing. And I don't want to ask you a specific question, but why do you, as therapists and coaches, talk about or mention psychedelics on your homepage?
Yeah. Well, so we offer psychedelic. We mentioned, right? We met at this festival, and we were offering psychedelic integration, right? We were just basically next to the medic tent and offering psychological care to people who had taken substances and were experiencing difficulties dealing with it.
Yeah.
And that's a topic really close to our heart. So we offer psychedelic integration because, well, we're in the epicenter of the spiritual world, at least in Berlin and maybe Europe, I don't know. One of the epicenters. So there's a big drug culture in Berlin, and people abuse all kinds of things for all the wrong reasons. And people experience lots of different psychedelics and other kinds of drugs. And we just want to help them integrate the experiences and to not hop from one peak experience to the next, but just to stand still and see what the actual benefit is, right? And we definitely see this as the next frontier in mental health. I mean, that's how you and I met, right, Alistair? We just met at this drug science conference at Charité, right? And there's so much, there's so many studies out there right now that are being conducted on psychedelics for mental health purposes. So
and we could go in there in very detail, but that's a whole podcast. But in general, what psychedelics do is potentially two things. They give you a new perspective on yourself and on your experiences, and we use this picture of a marble who goes in the same circle over and over again, and the more it goes in the circle, the deeper
the groove becomes, right?
The groove
This child
becomes,
toy.
and thereby alternative seems less likely because it's stuck in the routine. And what psychedelics do, they plane the field, and then the marble can go in different directions again. And that's
Yeah.
what happens with people. They go on a party, don't think about anything, then partying, take it, and for then they see possibilities popping up, but they are disorienting and confusing. And what we can help them do is make sense of it in a healing way when it comes to looking at their own life stories and at their trauma and all these things. And the studies on PTSD and many other things show that that's what they do.
Right, because taking a psychedelic is one thing, right? But the actual work starts afterward, right? Where you open up these new avenues of thinking, these new possibilities, but then what do you do with them, right? Because the danger is very much that you're going to integrate everything into the old system and then you've gained nothing.
Sometimes even make it worse. And that's where we come in.
Yeah.
We try to help them integrate it in a new way.
Or you suffer new trauma, right? Because
Yeah.
that happens frequently.
Yeah. So maybe finishing off. So for the audience, we have not prepared for a second episode, but I really have the feeling it makes sense. Either again the three of us, or I will think of whom else I could invite to link. I actually would like to link psychedelics not only to therapy and healing, but definitely also to the meditation piece. But that's definitely too much of the podcast. If there is a call to action, which I try to incentivize towards the end of each episode, imagine somebody listens to this podcast, audio only, or watches the video, and becomes aware of patterns in life, or becomes aware that like coping mechanisms don't work anymore. What is your advice? Because there's like so many therapists out there. The field is so broad.
Yeah.
What's your advice to find the right match in between a client and a therapist?
That's a really good question. And there's one thing that we have to say. First of all, it's a really exhausting and annoying way to get there because the system is just horrible. But on the upside, it's like dating.
Yeah.
You have to click on a human to human level. The approach is not important. The school is not important.
No.
All these things are really not important. You have to click on a human level. You have to feel seen, understood, taken serious, and from there everything works.
Everything's possible if the connection is right.
Yeah, there has to be a connection because the most healing thing is the relationship you create. And the other things are just tools to make that happen.
Exactly, because realistically, right, most of the trauma that happens in relation to other humans. So most of the healing will also happen in a relationship with another human.
It's not even most of it. It's just going to happen in a relational way. There is no way you can heal a relational wound within yourself. That's literally impossible.
Yeah. Wow, that's a very pessimistic note to end on.
No, not at all. That's a call for action.
Well, I would say self-compassion. Compassion is maybe a call to action. Let's all be more compassionate.
Yes.
Let's all be more compassionate. I have the feeling these are very wisely chosen closing words. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening in. And
thanks for having us.
I now know that Bridgee, Marius, me, and maybe another person will hop and dive deeper on some of the last
work on my
topics
political
mentioned.
correctness.
No,
okay.
Please don't work on your political correctness. Please not. Please
There's no
not.
such-
This is why I chose the live format, right? So you know, it's like it's raw and uncut out there. Thanks, Bridgee. Thanks, Marius.
Thanks.
Thank you.